So first presenter is Daniel Benefo, Environmental Protection Agencies, Ghana. So Daniel, you have a floor and you can start your presentation. So can you hear me?
Yeah, so I think our approach to the authorization had been to focus on the comprehensive nature of authorization, and therefore our approach for implementing authorization had been based on for 6.2 the need to link authorization to cooperative approaches, and therefore that for us is very important, and therefore the remits and the mechanics for authorization ought to be linked to the requirement in a cooperative approach, and therefore it ought to be specific to that. We also hold the view that in the case of Ghana, the administration and the legal basis for authorization is contained in the Ghana's Article 6.2 framework. So we have separated the operations for the authorization for 6.2 and captured it in the 6.2 framework that we have prepared for the country. We have also taking time to look at what are the things that we need to authorize and what are the interlinkages. So, whilst we are looking at the broad nature of authorization, we are looking into authorizing entities and activities and also authorizing mitigation outcomes for use. And therefore, that is the authorization. So the preconditions for authorizations in Ghana is quite first of all, it is linked to the NDCs because we are yet to come up with our long-term emission development strategy, and therefore in the NDCs we are not authorizing activities or projects in what we call the red list. So the red list are what we call the unconditional NDCs, and therefore one very important criteria or precondition for authorization of mitigation outcomes is that it ought not to be in the red list, and those red lists are those that we deem as not being additional. We have also then focusing on authorizing from the conditional NDCs and potentially those that are outside the NDCs, insofar as those activities are covered in the national inventories. So that is one very important precondition for issuing authorization. Apart from that, there are also some procedural requirements that we have also published in terms of having to open an account so we can keep record of the list of authorization, the fact that it can be authorized at the point of registration. So that is also very important requirement for us. The timing of authorization in our case, of course, it ought to happen before first transfer. But in our view, we think that authorization would serve three very important purposes. It ought to give a clear positive signal for private sector investment. And therefore, in our case, we think that it ought to happen soon enough for private sector to be able to receive the positive signal for investing in those projects. And therefore, we are authorizing at the point of registration. Definitely, the period of authorization is consistent with our first NDCs, and also it's also in sync with the crediting period of most projects. The other point I wanted to also highlight had been done by the previous speaker, that authorization would then kickstart or would then trigger the various provisions in the 6.2 to guidance as well. The minister responsible for environment is the competent entity to issue the letter of authorization, and is based on recommendation by the the Carbon Market Committee, or the so-called Article 6 board. So those boards will receive the request for authorization, and the board will make recommendation for the Ministry of Environment to finally give the authorization, and that will then trigger the preparation of the initial reports, and the minister himself will then sign the letter of authorization and also the statement of authorization as well. How they are to inform the implementation of the authorization requirements so here it is clear that we are doing an ex-ante authorization prior to the creation of the mitigation outcomes, and also follow it up with what we call the positive examination of the credit before there's issuance and first transfer. Here are some of the issues that are covered in the letter of authorization. It covers the core element in 2CMA3. We have also introduced some provisions regarding unforeseen circumstances that would lead to the revocation of the LOA, and also the need to put in place a redress mechanism should that happen. We have also taken into account the need to open the LOA for the purposes of scaling up the ambition of the activity that had received the LOA from Ghana. So apart from covering the basic elements of 2CMA3, we have these three very important elements to also respond to the need of the private sector or the project developers in terms of that. The other issue is also the potential or the possibility of creating or transferring the LOA to a different alternate contact point once that should happen. So again, we have covered the need for the possibility of transferring the LOA to a different entity that is also can participate as a participant in an activity as well. So this is to give you a flavor of who in Ghana or how we are authorizing and how is it linked to the NDCs and the content and the content of our LOA. So far, we have issued one LOA last year during the COP to a rice project, and it's been a very interesting learning process for us on how you can then operationalize the process of authorization. Thank you very much.
Daniel, thank you very much for your presentations, and it's very, very helpful for understand the timing and the authorization steps in your country. So again, thank you very much for your presentations. So now our next presenter, I would like to invite David, Swedish Energy Agencies. So I think that Sweden is also one of the country who are working on the Article 6. So David, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I assume you have the presentation here. Good, thank you very much. Yes, what I'd like to talk about here is, in a very kind of practical sense, how we have approached authorization under Article 6.2 in Sweden. I should emphasize that this is a preliminary approach. It's a suggestion, or something similar to this is going to be a suggestion we send into the Swedish government for approval. But this is kind of what we're at right now in this process. I should also mention that this is from the perspective of Sweden as an acquiring country, where the Swedish Energy Agency can be the buyer, or potentially a Swedish private company could also be the buyer under this situation. But this is the authorization process from the perspective of an acquiring country. And finally, I should also mention that we are acquiring ITMOs in Sweden for other purposes. And the reason for that is currently in the EU, we are unable to acquire ITMOs for NDC adjustment because it's currently not allowed in the EU. So if EU countries acquire ITMOs currently, it is for other purposes. And in our case, the other purpose is for a national target that Sweden has that kind of goes above and beyond our contribution to the EU's NDC. We have a special national target with supplementary measures, including Article 6, that goes above the EU NDC, and it's towards that additional target that we would be applying ITMOs, or these other purpose ITMOs. So we can go to the next slide. So these are the authorizations, just to kind of give an overview of the necessary authorizations under Article 6.2 and 6.4, and, you know, by each party. So under 6.2, they are the same for the host and acquiring countries, meaning the cooperative approach, the entities, and the ITMOs all need to be authorized. Under Article 6.4, it's a little bit different, but I don't need to go so much into that now, as I'll be focusing on Article 6.2. But I've shown here in practice how these authorizations, they would look like in terms of a form. For the cooperative approach under 6.2, it's in the form of a bilateral agreement between the two countries. For the entities, it's via a letter of authorization or letter of approval in the host and acquiring countries, and the same goes for the ITMOs. So with that said, we can go to the next slide. In developing this process, we have sought to achieve kind of three goals. One is that it's a transparent process, both for the Swedish government, of course, but also for actors, entities that could potentially participate in a cooperative approach, and of course the host country. So it needs to be clear on what basis the order that the authorizations are happening in, and on what basis. Also, to have an objective determination of appropriate projects or activities. In other words, we need to be able to, we've looked to kind of separate the role, and this gets into the next point, to separate the role of determining authorization from determining appropriate activities, whether that's the energy agency that's investing in these activities, or if it's a private company in Sweden. We want to keep this process separate, and that's to avoid the critique that might come that, for example, if the Swedish Energy Agency has received a mission to, you know, acquire perhaps a certain amount of reductions or Article 6 ITMOs, and that in order to do that, we've kind of unduly influenced or rushed the procedure of determining appropriate projects. We tried to separate the project kind of approval from the authorization of the projects. So now we can go to the next slide. And this is kind of the core of what we've been talking about. The light green boxes are actual authorizations is required by Article 6 under 6.2 for an acquiring country, and the dark green are additional steps. So the first step is that we recommend to the Swedish government that the Swedish Energy Agency, SEA, should be authorized as a national authority. This is not required under Article 6.2. It's something that's required under Article 6.4. But we want to, at this point, in the early point, even under 6.2, have a national authority, which is the authority responsible for these authorizations, already in place, so that the transition to 6.4 will be smooth, and we'll already have a process in place for that. So that the government then authorizes the Swedish Energy Agency to be the national authority in charge of authorizations. The first authorization would occur in the form of a bilateral agreement between Sweden and the host country. So the first authorization. The second would be the authorization of acquiring entities. So you might have, for example, a private company in Sweden that wants to invest in a project in a host country. They need to be authorized, and we need to be able to look at them in terms of, it's a simple process of perhaps just looking that they're a registered company and that they are solvent. We kind of run a credit check on them, and then they can be an acquiring entity for, you know, multiple different activities within a bilateral agreement. Then, of course, if the Swedish Energy Agency is the buyer and the actual acquirer of the ITMOs and not a private company within Sweden, then we have a procurement process, of course, and we examine the proposals that come in from that process. Alternatively, if a private company in Sweden wants to invest in the project in the host country, we would not, of course, have a procurement process, but they would need to submit the proposals for these activities to the Swedish Energy Agency for approval. So regardless of which channel it comes through, it still comes to the Swedish Energy Agency. And if Swedish Energy Agency is the buyer, we make a decision as to whether to sign a MOPA with the activity developer. And so this decision weighs heavily, of course, into the decision to authorize ITMOs for use later. But if the Swedish Energy Agency is not the buyer of the ITMOs, then we don't need to have that step. But what we do need to have, regardless of who is the buyer, the Swedish Energy Agency or a Swedish company, we need to authorize the selling entities. In other words, the entity or project developer in the host country needs to be approved. And we suggest that this approval basically be contingent on, or this authorization is contingent on the host country's authorization of the entity. So if the host country has authorized a certain company within that country to sell, then we will also recognize and authorize that entity as part of the cooperative approach. After the authorization of the selling entities, then we have a kind of a final examination of the activity where we internally determine whether we want to recommend this activity for authorization. And in addition to that, of course, you're going to have a validation that comes in at this point too. And provided that there's an approved validation of the activity, these two factors become the underlying points for the decision by the national authority to authorize ITMOs for use. So this occurs, as in the case of Ghana, ex ante. Before the ITMOs are generated, we have authorized them for use. And we've had discussion around, well, ex ante, ex post. With an ex ante authorization, you provide an early, clear signal to the market and to the actors, the entities involved, the project developers, that the countries intend to acquire the ITMOs, provided that everything works out as planned. They intend to acquire the ITMOs. The disadvantage with this is you have to add an additional step at the end. After the ITMOs are actually generated, there needs to be some sort of final approval. Ghana calls it a positive examination, for example, or a final approval of the ITMOs, that things have gone as planned in the project description, or the MAD, if you will, the Mitigation Activity Design document. The alternative to this is to have an ex post authorization, where you provide perhaps some sort of initial indication of approval of the project, and then the authorization comes after the ITMOs are generated and likely verified. That would be an ex post. This has the advantage, of course, of knowing that the ITMOs that you're authorizing are actually in line with what was intended from the beginning. However, this authorization, because authorization is an important key term that will be global in nature, in which most people who work with Article 6 recognize, because authorization is a critical point in the Article 6 process, not having an ex ante authorization, in other words, having an ex post authorization after the ITMOs are generated, could lead to less security for the private sector. If you give a preliminary approval is not the same as an authorization, perhaps, in the eyes of the public or the private sector. And so it's a little bit less of a strong statement of approval of the project, which is why we've decided to go with the ex ante authorization of ITMOs. Which means, as I've outlined here, of course, that the ITMOs are generated, there's a final approval. That final approval is contingent on basically the MAD, or the project description, being fulfilled as planned. There's nothing that's occurred in the way of threats to SDGs, human rights, anything like that could undermine the quality of the ITMOs in question. And based on that, there's a final approval. And then after that, what happens is, after the final approval, we would wait to hear from the host country if they, of course, have also given their final approval for the ITMOs and issued them into their registry. And at that point, they can connect with us. There's no perhaps centralized registry in this case, but we each have our own registries. And the host country could say, we've issued these we've approved them, and now they're issued into our registry, at which point we would issue the ITMOs into Sweden's registry. And this is kind of what would constitute, on a technical level, a transfer under 6.2 between the host country and Sweden, the acquiring country. And so this is kind of how we've tried to operationalize in a very practical sense these notions of these different authorizations and these notions of timing and when it should occur. And so, yes, I think that's all for me.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentations. I think in terms of the practical, I think perspectives, it's very, very helpful for us to consider the process of the authorization. So again, thank you very much. And I think we received the questions on the presentation, I think sharing. Say, yeah, after the today's working groups, yeah, after we confirming the with the speakers, we will we plan to upload the slides on our website. So that is our actually answer to the questions from the floor. So so now I would like to invite the third presenters, Bilal Shkarin from Jordan. So if Bilal, if you are ready to start, so you can now you have a floor to start. Can you hear me?
Well, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to present what Jordan did within the Article 6 portfolio. I don't know if you can share the presentation, or should I put it from my side? Thank you. Well, in Jordan, as a developing country, we've been so looking for the Article 6 and how can we use such methodology within our climate change portfolio, and how can we move forward in order to implement the most efficient ways and pathways for low carbons that we can make use, not only within the reduction of that carbon, but also within the ongoing benefits of other economical instruments, such like Article 6 provides. Can we go to the next slide, please? So Jordan, we've been working in the country within the support of international entities. One of the most important international entities was the World Bank, and still the World Bank with us. Talking about the history of Jordan, we've been one of the first countries who signed and ratified the Paris Agreement, and ratified also the Convention for Climate Change, the same for Kyoto. And within Kyoto, within the mechanism of the CDM, we went with 4 registries projects, and to go within that scheme, and we were planning to add much more, but after Doha Amendment happened 2012, as everybody knows, there was some changes in the market, in the carbon market, and after Paris Agreement and within the new schemes and the new consensus when it would be finalized and finished for the Article 6, we are preparing the country and the enabling environment in the country for that to do so. And accordingly, we've developed a policy framework that will help us to move forward within the preparation of the country to enter the carbon market. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. Well, within that, we are thinking within the country level policy framework in order to include all of our commitment to the climate action. And so within that, we are committed to ensure our NDCs. This is something, and also to understand what's potentials of carbon markets and what can we do as following, and what can we do with the incoming income or revenue from those markets. How could it be used? What could be used in those markets? And within that, parts and the paragraphs of Article 6. And it was formalized in a way or another into a strategy that the country will adopt and move within it, and within creating the infrastructure at the country so that we can move within that. At the same time, we are planning, and it's on our day-to-day plans. We are planning to develop the capacity in all of the aspects that could help and could support within the market issuance. So within that, we are talking. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. As within that, and within going and creating the infrastructure itself, we've been with the World Bank previously within the PMR, Partnership for Market Readiness. Within that, we've developed our national MRV system that will monitor, report, and verify the reduction of carbon reduction issues. And it is connected also to the greenhouse gas inventory. And within that, we are able later to develop an ETS system, emission trading system in the country as a national issue, or to move within ITMOSs to be traded outside the country in the compliance market, or next slides will show, or those which won't be used in the compliance market, it could be used also in the voluntary market. So within that also the system, it was developed in a way. Thank you for moving the slide. Okay, the process was developed in order also to be within the climate hub, the World Bank Climate Hub, data hub that can enable us in the future to facilitate the wave and pave it for the carbon market itself. Within the policy framework that we've did in the country, we had within it the guiding principles, which can show us what's the what does it mean environmental integrity, what does it what's the alignment with the Article 6 paragraph, especially paragraph 6.2, and what are we doing as a framework for the eligibility mitigation outcomes and the activities, how to move within it, and how to validate, how to monitor, verify, and issue those carbon credits within that, and who's the eligible entities for doing this independent assessment or any other issue. Within the framework, it has to be approved and authorized. The approval of the activity itself, the authorization of the processes, especially for Article 6.3, and also the issuance of the mitigation outcomes. Okay, what's the how to create those mitigation outcomes and how to do it, how to use it, what's the correspondence adjustment that we're gonna use, whether it was ITMOSs or it was carbon credits in the market, in the national market itself, and who are the governance of the framework itself, the policy itself, who's the DNA, who will work within the DNA, and if you are requesting for something and there is any kind of trouble or any kind of misunderstanding, how to appeal and how to work within it. The framework also contains the definitions, the sustainable development criteria, the validation of the MRV itself, the eligibility criteria, and all of the registry procedures and the reporting procedures, the function of that. We as a DNA, what do we need to do, and what do we need to achieve at the same time, how are we gonna organize that internally within the inline ministries, inline entities of the government itself, including also the private sector engagement. So within that and within the World Bank approach, okay, we are expecting in the upcoming 1 or 2 years that Jordan will be so active and will be within the carbon market in a very good manner that can provide the carbon market with the atmosphere that we can develop. At the same time, we can make the use of the revenues or the use of the carbon market itself in order to develop a low carbon pathways in our carbon reduction actions. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. Well, thank you. As a simulation or in a very simple way, I prefer the slide that I had the control from my side. So can you please just click it several times? I don't need to just tell you several times until the. Okay, thank you so much. Well, the matter is that the country can announce what are we approaching for the policy framework? What are we approaching for the mitigation outcomes? What are we approaching even how are we gonna both that to meet our requirement in the country? As you know, one gap that we do have it in our other governance system in the climate change is that the government itself did not yet reflect the compliance and the commitment of the NDCs on the private sector themselves. So we are the entity as a government, we are the one who is responsible for that, with no responsible yet for the private sector, but we are trying to make the balance between both so we can make use without going beyond the unresponding for our NDCs. And within the buying entities and the buying parties, who are they, how would they, and for how many years they would like to buy. And within that, we can go within after several procedures and several approvals, we can give an issue as a government. We can issue the letter of authorization. If you can notice, at this slide, within the letter of authorization, we have a star, which means and which is shown beneath that this is so separate and independent document than the commercial agreement, which will be used according to the pricing scheme all over the market. Can we go for the next, please? Okay. Well, depending on the level of comfort, the framework as for now still as a draft, and we are looking for this year, hopefully by the end of the year or by the, let's say, the first term of 2024, that it will be fully reviewed, fully authorized from all other entity. It gives the country and it gives the government to go within two types of approvals. It can give a one-step approval and approving the activities itself, authorizing, and also going within furthermore for the commercial agreement itself. And this would be defined with a specified time and period for the selling itself, or it could go within the other approach, which take much more step or two, which needs the approval and authorization, then the approval of the activities, then to authorize the activity and participants. Then after that, to authorize each batch of mitigation outcomes. Well, both types of both types are good and good activities, and each one has its own let's say it has own characteristics which preferred from some, and the other is preferred from some. So our policy framework can give us the choice to use each of those authorization schemes. Can we go to the next one, please? Okay. And also this criteria that authorizes, it was developed by us as a Ministry of Environment. Ministry of Environment, by the way, at the country, at Jordan, we are representing the climate change, and we are the focal point for the Convention, for Kyoto Protocol, and we are the focal point for all related issues within carbon market. So, but we are always working in our National Climate Change Committee, which is led by the Minister of Environment, and it has as members the Secretary Generals of 16 other allied ministries. So we do not work alone. We are working always in consensus with all of the governmental partners and the private sector partners in the country. So we are using this, and this criteria will include and may include everything about the work and the activities itself, the project type and the technology. This also can be used later on in the pricing scheme, and the additionality, how and what's the measure of additionality that each project that has, what does it how would it promote, and the promotion of the sustainable development, the insurance of environmental integrity. I will not read the rest, you can see it by yourself. I don't want to take much of your time than the time that I've been given as 10 minutes. But the most important, we should go within the compliance anti-corruption laws, and we should go within the compliance with other local regulatory issues and schemes in order to be compatible with all that we are working in order to do or to enhance the work environment, the implementation environment for climate responses project, whether it was the tangible projects, or it was for the economic wise, or the market-based tools usage within that in order to implement our climate change policy. Well, the government also, of course, goes within the course here, and goes within the participation for the aviation sector in a way that can help both of the other party who would like to participate and buy, at the same time to the national party who is engaged with the aviation union all over. Let's go for the next, please. This is the last one. Thank you so much. There is some additionalities. If there's any questions, we've got some additional 2 to 3 slides, and I'm happy that it would be shared to participants here, so that they are they have the most the situation, and to know much more about Jordan movement within that. Again, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to present our work within that in Jordan, and thanks for the previous presenters. I had it was so fruitful to hear their experience each on their countries. Thank you so much. Over to you, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Abel, for your presentations. And yeah, it's a final slide on the criteria. It's very much interesting for us. So the final speaker is Simon Fermeyer, a federal officer for the environment of the Switzerland. So Simons, over to you.
Thank you so much. I believe you have my slides, so you can try to bring them on. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to, well, Japan for the continued leadership that we've seen over the years, but in particular also here. It's great to see all this input, and I'm really looking forward to the session. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So I was very pleased to hear from Daniel earlier on, and we from Switzerland, we are happy to share that we, and many of you I think have already heard this, we have authorized 2 activities in the context of 6.2 so far. I've given you a screenshot of our website. As a general reminder, a lot of the information that I'll just be speaking to very superficially is all in the public domain, and I'm very happy to share all these things. And so we have authorized 2 activities, one in Ghana and one in Thailand. One was around COP, as Daniel said, and the other one was actually just back in February. And you can go to the next slide, please. So I think all the different presenters here took different approaches to the presentation. I'm not sure which one you were most looking for, but I have the feeling they all complement one another. What I'm now trying to share is also a bit on the legal basis. And actually, it's really quite funny because these are a multitude of bases for authorizing. And so I'll go through these in the Swiss example. So we are doing all of what we are doing. As you've seen, we've signed several bilateral agreements. Now we have 2 concrete activities that are authorized. We're doing that because this is mandated in a law that was adopted by our parliament. This is the Swiss CO2 Act. Under that, we have an ordinance, which is something like a bylaw, which would set out the criteria, as we had just seen from my colleague from Jordan, exclusion criteria that were also mentioned in the presentation of Daniel. And then we go even one further level down, and all of these documents are public, a technical implementation guidance that was published by our ministry. This is one big chapter, one big chunk of legal basis. And another one is, of course, the bilateral agreements themselves, of which we have signed 11 so far. And when it comes to authorizations, it's very clear, or at least the way we have designed these bilateral agreements, is that there's a very important need to coordinate when you get to authorization, because the bilateral agreement itself doesn't actually tell you the whole story. It is based, enshrined in the end in these decisions of the two cooperating parties. And so we have seen this in our experience with Ghana and with Thailand, that there were coordination efforts. Sometimes one runs fast, the other one is a bit behind, then you have an approval issue here. And so it is quite funny to see how it all plays out, but it's also really a great learning. And then finally, of course, there's another third big chunk of legal basis, and that's anything that comes out of the UNFCCC process. And of course, I think that's where some of these questions, also we heard from Sana, all the elements that could or could not be regulated on the CMA level. We remain open to hearing views from other parties on that. But for now, I think we have a relatively light touch regulation on authorizations as it is currently stated in guidance that was adopted. And so what we know for now, as Sana had said, of course, that once you authorize, you shall submit that authorization, and then you also add the initial report, ideally right away at that same moment. And there will be other reporting coming later, regular reporting, annual information report, and so on. And so you can go back to my first slide after this presentation, and you'll see we have uploaded these elements all in one go, together with the actual MADD of the concrete activity and the validation report. They are all in the public domain. Then next slide, please. Then in terms of decision-making process, and I think as far as I saw, I think not many others went into this. So it's just an FYI, you know, maybe you're not interested in it, but like just to share with you how we are running this. So basically where I work at the Federal Office for the Environment, we lead this file. It is obviously an environment climate file, and I work in the climate division, and within that division there's a compensation team that, you know, tries to put forward all these different corporations that we have with partner countries. And we don't do that on our own, but whenever it comes to one of those decisions to authorize or not, we, well, prepare an idea, an assessment, conditions, and so on and so forth. But we coordinate on 2 levels with the Foreign Ministry, Economy Ministry, Energy Ministry, and other ministries as relevant could be, depending on the concrete activity. And so this really works kind of on 2 levels. First, it's experts like me and many other experts in the administration come to a conclusion, and then, or a primary recommendation, and then this goes up to the director level. And this is actually, in the end, all of these authorizations are approved by an organ that has the different directors sitting in it. And in the end, that letter is then can then be signed once that organ has approved it. Next slide, please. So this is, of course, a way too small slide, so I'm very sorry for that, but it's just a screenshot. And I just wanted to give you a chance to take a look at it. Again, this is in the public domain, like the types of elements that we have put into our authorization statement. Date, the entities authorized, what you can use them for, a definition of first transfer, of course, the activity itself. And then we also always add, for now, and we are also very well, you know, happy to receive feedback on what else we could add or what we should leave out, the total volume that can be transferred as part of this authorization, crediting period, and when this, until when these units can actually be used. And of course, there's CMA guidance on this, should be within the same NDC period. But we also wanted to re-enshrine this in the authorization statement to be very, very clear. And then finally, also our method of corresponding adjustment. You will see here on this slide that under the 3rd point, like ITMOs in this particular case are authorized for NDCs. If we go to the next one, next slide, you will see here the authorization is broader. And I think that just reinforces that point that David made just earlier, that it very much depends on how the host country assesses the cooperation and how they would like to authorize. And that is, of course, you know, the guiding star for how the cooperating party will also do it. So like this, as you can see in these statements, like we always reflect the breadth of authorization that is given by the host party. And that is then also how we authorize. So this is just another example. And as a statement, well, you know, these authorizations, of course, they can differ by country or by corporation within the same country. And then next slide, please. And this is already my final slide. So just to summarize, I try to keep it brief. So we can maybe discuss a little bit. The elements that we currently cover in our authorization letter are the entity authorized, maximum volume, use type, time validity, saying that it's for now any letter that we issue is until 2030 and the use within the same NDC implementation period. And I had just heard from, no, I'm not sure who said it, but like in our case as well, with regard to that ex ante, ex post debate, our authorization normally comes in at the moment of registration. That's the moment where the activity is about to start and just has the green light from the regulating entities. And so the moment of authorization is not the same as the moment of transfer. And the transfer would normally just be significantly later. Once you have your monitoring report coming in, it's verified, and the entities, regulating entities, have looked at it and are fine with actually doing the transfer and then actually doing the corresponding adjustments based on that transfer. And that is always not done, you know, by the governments, but this is done by private entities that were authorized. And then just finally, because on the level I just heard, Some authorization statements are signed by ministers. In our case, actually, this decision is made on the director level across these different entities, but then the authorization is signed by the head of the climate division in the ministry where I work. And that's all from my end. Back to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much.